Welcome to this episode of Men Who Understood the Times. I am Pastor Michael Zarling with Andy and Josh. Uh, Gentlemen, can you guys believe that this is episode 20 already? For 20 weeks straight, we've been able to get together, even though it's difficult sometimes with guys who have colds and bad voices or batteries that don't start, and so forth. Uh, and for our listeners too, we always try and do a bunch of topics and we're talking about them during the week. And there's several of them we've been trying to get to, but the devil keeps throwing more new things into the news cycle. So these issues that we want to talk about keep getting pushed aside, and we'll get to them because the one we're going to talk about tonight is the invasion of God's sacred space based on the events of last Sunday. Before we get there, a disclaimer that with everything that we talk about is just three guys that are sitting around on tonight is a Saturday evening, and we've got our drinks. So I have a Lush Puppy, an IPA that one of my members left for me. Josh, what do you have this evening?
I also just have a IPA, just my standard Lakefront Brewery,
There
regular
you
old
go.
Indian Pale Ale.
And Andy is feeling under the weather today. So what are you drinking?
I'm drinking tea with honey.
Uh, your voice sounds kind of rough, not quite as rough as Josh's did a couple of weeks ago. Yeah, so we're going to be talking about the events of that happened in the Southern Baptist Church in the Minneapolis area. So just a little lead in that the last few weeks in Minneapolis have been crazy. My wife is going to be going there to take care of my mom in a little while, and she's nervous about having to be anywhere in the Minneapolis area. That subpoenas have gone out from the Department of Justice to Minnesota Governor Tim Walz to Attorney General Keith Ellison, Minneapolis Mayor Jacob Fry, uh, and then on top of that, you've got Governor Walz saying that Minnesota is in a war with the federal government, likening it to the Civil War. You've got uh, and that's where President Trump is thinking about uh, bringing the Insurrection Act against uh, Governor Walz. You've got the mayor, Jacob Fry, who's making similar comments publicly, where he is talking about residents and his own police officers having to fight against the federal officers. And so that's just going to ratchet up tensions. And when you watch that video where the mayor says that, the police chief is standing right there and his eyes get real wide and raises his eyebrows for a second. He's in disbelief. Uh, so all of that just, I think, is stoking all of this tension. And then with this tension, you've got uh, rioters, protesters that storm into a church. So uh, we're going to save Andy's voice on this one. So Josh, you want to lay out for our listeners kind of the events that happened with that church from your perspective?
Sure. Um, from what I understand, and well, actually, let me back up for a second. So, again, the title of our podcast is Men Who Understood the Times. And our tagline, which we can't add anymore because we can't edit the YouTube logo, is not that we're claiming to be those guys, but that's what we're pursuing. And we're kind of inviting you guys along for the ride um, to learn and to ascertain wisdom on these things with open Bibles. And so, as we're recording this, the news has just come out that there's been another shooting in Minneapolis, and we debated talking about that. We decided, you know what, there just aren't enough facts available. And yet, as I'm looking on my social media on my other screen here, I see brothers and sisters in Christ who are throwing in their 2 cents on this. And I don't understand how that's wise because we just don't have enough information at this point. And so going to that episode at that Baptist church in Minneapolis, okay. Um, I think I think a good summary of that, and either one of you, please correct me if I'm wrong, is they were having church, having a totally normal church service like the ones that we all attend or preach in every Sunday. And that service was disrupted by a group of professional agitators whose purpose and job it is um, to disrupt, to call attention to themselves and therefore their political message. Um, and their goal outside of that was to cause extreme discomfort and extreme fear, which I think terror would be a good definition of that. Um, the picture that comes to mind, if you Google that episode, there was a man shielding a small child who was sobbing from the mayhem that was unfolding around them, and I don't understand what that accomplishes. Like if I was on the side rhetorically, which I'm not, but if I know there was an assertion at some point that the pastor was somehow involved with ICE. Um, I'd not heard what specifically, if he was an agent. I can't imagine a pastor moonlighting as an ICE agent. I've heard them, working at basketball games, passing out concessions, but working as an ICE agent, that seems pretty extreme. I know there's like administrative capacities too. Um, we should clarify that. Do either of you know specifically what the allegation was that one of the pastors was?
No, but let's just say that he was, and
Sure. Let's say he
I
was an
think
agent. Let's
yeah,
say, here's the
and
thing.
that's
I, I have high school kids who have come to me for advice, saying, I want to help my community. I'm considering becoming uh, a law enforcement officer, or I want to go into the military. I've had kids go into the Marine Corps because they want to serve and they want to protect, and they are men who are given certain wiring by God, and they want to be protectors. They want to fulfill that, and they want to do that under the law. And so if we go to Romans chapter 13 here, okay? The question has to be, if you are a law enforcement agent and ICE is a legitimate law enforcement entity that incidentally precedes Trump by many years. I believe it was called into existence after 9/11, right? Um, and so here we go. Romans 13. Let everyone be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except that which God has established. The authorities that exist have been established by God. Consequently, whoever rebels against authority is rebelling against what God has instituted. For those who do so will bring judgment on themselves. For rulers hold no terror for those who do right, but for those who do wrong. Do you want to be free from the fear of one in authority? Then do what is right, and you'll be commended. For the one in authority is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for rulers do not bear the sword for no reason. They are God's servants, agents of wrath, to bring punishment to the wrongdoer. Now, we only will go against this if they are either actively doing things that God says no to or actively commanding us to do things that God says no to. And so I think that needs to be the focus here. Is ICE functioning within the law? Either of you guys have thoughts on that? I think that they are, or more to the point, I see no evidence that they're not. Now, I would leave room though for individual people. You can have rogue cops, you can have rogue Marines commit atrocities that aren't sanctioned by the state or their training, right? Where people are sinful. Um, is that what's happening here on scale? Is the department or is the government here out of line for wanting to enforce borders?
well, so a couple of things on that is here, I'm going to read something for you, and I'll let you guys tell me who said this. Uh, all Americans are rightly disturbed by the large numbers of illegal aliens entering our country. The jobs they hold might otherwise be held by citizens or legal immigrants. The public services they use impose burdens on our taxpayers. We are a nation of immigrants, but we're also a nation of laws. It's wrong and ultimately self-defeating for a nation of immigrants to permit the kind of abuse of our immigration laws we've seen in recent years, and we must do more to stop it. Any idea what president said that? Yep, you're right, Andy. It was uh, Bill Clinton in a State of the Union address. All right, I got another one. Even as we are a nation of immigrants and we're also a nation of laws, undocumented workers broke our immigration laws, and I believe that they must be held accountable. But even as we focus on deporting criminals, the fact is millions of immigrants in every state of every race and nationality still live here illegally. Which president said that? Yep. Boy, Andy is good buzzing in fast. That was Barack Obama. He put
Yep.
it into the group chat. So, boy, if you guys didn't know your president so well, most people, I think, would say, well, that's President Trump. He just wants to get rid of these people. What President Trump is saying is exactly the same thing that the two Democratic presidents uh, before him, besides Biden, had said. And they were doing the same thing. And Democrats had no problem with ICE underneath those presidents. So the question is then, uh, this is the same question I asked at the end of the last podcast is, are people allowing their Christian doctrines of the Bible to inform their politics, or are they ramping up their what they think is their perceived highest sanctification based on their politics? Okay. Uh, with that too, I have a daughter who's in the National Guard. So when those two National Guard guardsmen and guardswoman in Washington D.C. was shot and one was killed, execution. Well, I was very bothered by that. I would be bothered by any soldier, but especially knowing that that could have been my daughter. My daughter is in the Wisconsin National Guard. She could easily be in Minneapolis right now. Okay. She is on the side of the law. John the Baptist, to answer your question too, Josh, when the soldiers came to him out in the desert and asked, what should we do? He didn't say, stop being a soldier. He said, just do it in a Christian manner. Don't cheat people. Don't take their cloak and so forth. Uh, yeah, so I think as Christians, we can have questions, but the way we deal with those questions is what we're going to hear uh, on the third Sunday after Epiphany in our church services from First John, where John begins in that text of, he says, if you're followers of Christ, you're going to obey his commands. So I even have this in my sermon. If you're going to resist and protest, but you have to do it according to God's commands. And when you've got Don Lemon, who was a reporter embedded with this group that charged into the church, he said on a previous occasion, the whole idea of rioting and protests, and this was with the George Floyd protests in 2020 and 2021, he said the whole point of riots and protests is to make people feel uncomfortable. Well, making people feel uncomfortable, I don't think that fits in with God's commands. Okay.
He also claimed to be a Christian, so
Could I
He
chime
did
in
say
just
that.
briefly there, Mike?
Yeah,
Sure.
go for it.
Moreover, I think there are probably well-intending Christians who are deeply deceived by all the contextual things going on in this tumultuous time. And so there might be Christians out there who sincerely believe with all their heart, although I would disagree, but that ICE is in the wrong and that President Trump is in the wrong for commissioning ICE to do their work. It's still not appropriate. It's not only inappropriate for them to protest in the way that you just laid out, it's also inappropriate for them and not their vocation gifted to them by God to interfere with those governing authorities in the exercise of their duties, because they are not the arbiters of the legalities of ICE's deployment.
Yeah, the way I would maybe unpack it like this: do law enforcement agents uh have the right to use force to protect themselves? And I think the answer is yes. If people try to kill them, which happens, I mean, frequently, do they then have the right to use lethal force? And the answer is yes. And so they are armed and they are well trained in the use of those arms. How then is it wise for you to impede uh their legal justifiable function doing what they're doing in a way that is incredibly, I like your word earlier, ambiguous? You don't know what this person is going to do. And the difference between um you being fine and going home to your wife and children and you being dead. I mean, it's literally a second. Or you being fine and you needing to have a wheelchair for the rest of your life because you took a bullet in the spine or something like that. It's you have people who are all amped up on adrenaline. What good is it for you to be there in the first place? But these people have been told, they've been lied to, and they've been told that their moral imperative is that you personally, okay, not people in the like ether of the universe, you personally as an individual need to get into your um autopilot and you need to go get in their face. That's what stewardship looks like for you. That's what that's what you're called to do by God, is to go and impede the mission of these people on a regular basis. And I fail to see how that's wise or what you think you can accomplish with that. Um, what do you guys think?
Right. And with that too, again, I would go back to uh, COVID. Obviously, I thought that everything having to do with COVID, of shutting down small businesses, forcing people to shop at big box stores, telling some people that they were uh, essential, telling churches and other small businesses they were unessential, and so forth, telling people you've got to get this experimental drug. All of that would be government overreach, just like there are those who are claiming that what President Trump and the Department of Justice and ICE is doing is government overreach. And yet, I encourage people, hey, if you disagree with what the government's doing, then you need to resist. But I didn't see anyone going out and blowing whistles and putting their vehicles in front of other buildings or uh, any of these kinds of tactics. It was like what Andy said before. There is a way to do this, and we have to remember to do it and as best as we can in a Christian manner. We have to be above the fray. We have to be, uh, you know, we want to be pious and sanctified in everything that we're doing. And when you're blowing whistles, and I watched a video just before we started recording of an officer that told a lady, they were in an apartment building, you're blowing your whistle. If so, your one and only warning: if you don't stop blowing your whistle because you're impeding our investigation, I'm going to arrest you. What she said, I thought right away, boy, this is rather racist, because she said, well, I can't understand. You're Mexican. He's got his face mask on and everything. I can't understand your poor Mexican English. Uh, so that I thought was awful right away. And then she said, well, how can blowing a whistle impede your investigation? How is that breaking the law? And that's where the video stopped. But it is. And let's move on to the next part, though. Uh, as we're talking about these particular protesters, is Andy, do protesters have a right to interrupt a worship service?
Well, by way of description, how did the Lord feel about Pharaoh prohibiting his people from going to worship? He didn't really like that, did he? And it turned out to be a capital offense for many Egyptians. Prescriptively, God has not just given Christians the imperative to love thy neighbor. He has engraved that on the consciences of every man. And if it's not love for your neighbor, no matter what the activity, it is prohibited. Now, legally, are they allowed to? I don't know that there's much debate on this. My understanding of the FACE law, the Freedom of Access to Clinic Entrances Act, it was it was established essentially to shield abortion doctors who mutilate women and babies before they're born, to shield them from criticism that was mostly peaceful and prayerful outside their clinics by and large. However, my understanding is that the FACE Act could apply in this case as well, although I don't know if churches are included in the actual.
They are. Yeah.
Okay, well, there you go.
Yeah, so with the FACE Act, I'll read to you what I found. So the Freedom of Access to Clinic Entrances of 1994 is a federal law prohibiting the use of force, threat of force, or physical obstruction to injure, intimidate, or interfere with anyone obtaining or providing reproductive health services, including abortions. It also protects places of religious worship, because that was the only way that they could get the FACE Act passed with Republicans, was to put worship in there. And what you noticed was President Biden using the FACE Act with his administration to use this law against any Christians that were outside of an abortion clinic. And now it is being used, hopefully, and that's going to be part 3 of this, on prosecution and so forth, against these people, because it is a federal crime to break into any church to protest their worship service.
Well, also, isn't it private property? I mean, like, I think if you're outside in the street in public property, then we would say, like, I would disagree with the ethos of it, but you would have the legal right anyway to peaceably protest whatever you like in the street or on the sidewalk. But to barge into a worship service that is owned by a congregation, that's private property. And your right to protest does have it has rhetorical limits. Like, I can't barge into someone's, like, my neighbor's house and protest X, Y, and Z. That's private property. I'll get arrested. You have castle doctrine to deal with there as well, where if he thinks that I walk into his house uninvited screaming, I mean, I'm probably taking my life in my hands. And so again, the question of how would that be wise, and what have you accomplished here? Did Don Lemon build a fan base here? Honest question, maybe he did with his fan base. I don't think he won over any converts from our side to his, however. And so again, how is that wise? What did that accomplish?
Yeah, and you think of it this way: what happens if someone disrupts an NFL game? They're not going to let that guy run around disrupting the game. They're going to have security guards. They're going to tackle him right away.
It just happened like last week,
also,
and one of the linebackers tackled the guy. He had like a streamer of like pink smoke or something, like a smoke canister, and one of the linebackers just annihilates the guy, and then he sued the NFL for however much for like injury or something. And so
yeah, but the NFL also limits who can come into their games.
Yeah.
And a house of worship is not a public forum for a protest. Like Andy or like Josh said, it is legal for you according to your First Amendment. You can be outside on the street or in the sidewalk. I'd have to check on it. I don't think they can be doing it while you're worshiping, though, is if they're going to be loud enough to disrupt your worship service. I remember having someone, this was years ago, that was going to be coming and talking at our church in Racine about homosexuality and being repentant of that sin and being naive to social media. I posted it, and then I got all kinds of comments from people in Racine saying, hey, they were going to come on and protest. I stopped promoting the event on social media, but then I called up a couple of my members and let them know, and they were there. We'll talk about this later on. They were armed and ready to protect. And I also called We had two members who were police officers, and the one happened to live right next to the church. And she told her police chief what was happening, and the chief gave her the okay to use the squad car while she was on her shift and just drive by the church. Now, nothing happened, but if they would have disrupted the worship service, I think that's going to be against the FACE Act. But I'm teeing this one up for you, Andy. How does attacking churches fit into the Marxist playbook?
Thank you very much. You really want me to lose my voice, don't you? So you might be surprised to hear it obviously is an emanation from Marxism, but there's a couple of different things we want to note about what's going on here. The first is that there is an element of Mott and Bailey with this. If anybody wants to Google, or I like DuckDuckGo, but you want to Google MOTTE and BAILEY, the Mott and Bailey rhetorical technique. I'll just give you a simple example of that. You can find this on the Answers in Genesis page 2 as a good example, but then I'll give you how it spells out. So someone might say, well, churches indoctrinate children with dangerous myths, so kids under 18 shouldn't be allowed to attend church. That's what's called, let me start here. The Mott is like a castle on a little hill or berm. It's surrounded by perhaps a moat, or then a little village of little huts that might be marketplace-like huts, trade huts, or also poor huts. And the concept is that when there's an attack on that campus, or that I should say on that territory, then those on the outskirts can retreat back into the Mott, or the castle. So an arguer will say, well, churches indoctrinate kids, so kids with myths, so kids under 18 shouldn't be allowed to go to church. And then it's totally flagrant and inflammatory thing to say. It's ridiculous, but it's deliberate, because then the one who responds logically and sensibly says, well, denying kids the right to worship, or the right to decide where to worship, would be a serious breach of religious freedom. And then the one who threw that flaming arrow says, well, I just want to defend the intellectual rights of children. And what they're doing is retreating back to the castle, but the damage is already done. The straw man has already been put out there.
And so can I hop in here just
sure.
real quick?
Yeah.
The Mott and Bailey fallacy is one that when I've given presentations on this is one of the points that's always like, that was confusing. If you've read any book by George Orwell, in particular 1984, it's doublespeak, where you have words that mean two things and the definitions being flip-flop back and forth. And so, for example, with DEI, we have the word inclusion. Inclusion can mean we just don't exclude anybody. Everybody's here. Inclusion can also mean a particular bent towards the LGBTQ movement and including them by excluding people who disagree with that. Now, if you don't know or have a solid definition and you're in a situation where this applies, you'll say, well, are you against inclusion? And until you establish, well, which version of that word are you talking about? You can have people with bad intentions say they mean one while implementing the other in practice. That's the situation. Sorry for interrupting. Go ahead.
No, perfect example too. It's doublespeak, and the way I was trying to frame it too has to do with like, this is one way that antagonists will push the envelope 2 steps forward, and then when you confront them, they'll just retreat, but only 1 step back. And so they advance incrementally, little by little through this technique. So in this case, protesters should be allowed to storm churches. That's like the flagrant, aggressive Bailey. It's the inflammatory, envelope pushing thing. And someone says, well, that's private property and it's also against the law. And then they say, well, they retreat, right? And they say, well, it's just important to protest the injustices of ICE. Well, it's like they've already done the damage. They've already given rise to the thought within their allies that this is something that might be permissible going forward. The second thing, though, as it pertains to Marxism, I know you guys, you're all familiar with how much I love to invoke that name. Well, let me introduce you to a new name, and that is the name of Michel Foucault.
Mm.
Foucault is the guy who, and if you want to ever read about him, I wouldn't necessarily recommend some of the scholarly work out there about him because it's probably going to be warm to his horrors. But Josh and I have both spoken on him. I've written about it a little bit in my critical theory paper. But Foucault is the one who criticized regimes of truth, quote unquote. He diluted the meaning of words in a way that Josh is just talking about.
Mhm.
And he's also the grandfather who blazed the brazen trail of critical sexual studies. So you can blame Foucault for things
Yeah.
like critical queer theory and such.
Yep.
But here's something from a book called Dialectics of Revolution, because revolution, make no mistake, is what is in process right now. But the author, Kevin B. Anderson, who's an ally, wrote this about Foucault. Foucault said power relationships very much existent. They depend on a multiplicity of points of resistance. Hence, there is no single locus of a great refusal, no soul of revolt, source of all rebellions, or pure law of the revolutionary. That means it's no holds barred. It's wherever you can get a flare up. It's here, there, and everywhere. There doesn't need to be cohesion or strategy in where it happens or who instigates it. It can be any age, any issue. It can be ambiguous or not. That that is an emanation of Marx, who really had, he thought that the uprising would revolve mainly around capital, right? But and uh, who's the Gramsci. Gramsci is the one who said, well, the revolution has to happen organically through all frames and mediums of culture. But Foucault is the one who said it's got to be just random or it can be random and sporadic in all these places too. And that's what you're seeing here. Minneapolis is just one of a number. It's just one of a number. J6 was sort of an emanation of one. It was really much more strategized, but you're going to see this elsewhere too. And you might see big issues, you might see little issues, but people need to begin talking about and realizing that this is absolutely the plan.
And and so with that too, uh, picking up on it with Don Lemon again, he was there, said he was a reporter, and afterwards, when he realized that he had broken federal law, then he claimed victim status. So he claimed that this was white supremacy on the basis of the church. So I'm going to read to you what he said in an interview. They are entitled, and that entitlement comes from white supremacy. They think that this country was built for them, that it is a Christian country. And again, he said that he was a Christian, even though he's a gay man living in an open, adulterous sin. His Christianity is not Christ's Christianity. But when he refers to this as white supremacy, that's code for Western civilization or uh, Christianity. And that's why Don Lemon thinks that it's okay to harass Christians while supposedly claiming to be a Christian. And yet, he and the other protesters would never be caught dead doing the exact same thing at a Muslim mosque or a Jewish synagogue. That's how you also know that Christianity is true because it's the only one that can be mocked. And the goal is destroying Christianity. The Baptists at St. Paul or in St. Paul, Minnesota, they're just in the way. So we're going to be saying they're breaking the law, Josh. So should protesters face prosecution?
Oh, absolutely. Why would they not? You can
Well,
forgive a
because
person. You can offer somebody forgiveness, um, while also having them pay the civil penalties for whatever their actions are. Um, Forgiveness involves, um, I'm letting this sin go, and I'm not going to hold this sin against you going forward. All right. Um, and if somebody killed a person that I love, um, I think I would really struggle with that. I'd like to think that I could get to a point of forgiving them from a biblical standpoint. that doesn't mean that I don't want them to go to prison for killing the person that I love. But those things are different, right?
Well, yeah,
Um,
the reason I ask is I'm sure some Christians will say this, and those who are non-Christians know just enough of the Bible to say, "Oh, you Christians, you're supposed to turn the other cheek." And didn't your Apostle Paul tell you that you're not supposed to sue other people?
sure, the whole turning the other cheek is a really misquoted passage. That's um, that passage speaks about me not taking vengeance for something that happened to me. That is not a situation where if somebody is harming my family, that I'm supposed to stand by passively and watch it happen. That's not what we're talking about here. Because there are other passages that say, um, as far as it is possible, or as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. That's Romans 12. Okay. Also, you must defend the defenseless. That's Proverbs 32. I'm screwing that up. Sorry. Um, I had it
Well,
marked earlier.
yeah, I've got a
But
couple of Bible verses on justice too.
sure.
Uh, Isaiah 117, learn to do right, seek justice, defend the oppressed, take up the cause of the fatherless, plead the case of the widow. Deuteronomy 16:20, follow justice and justice alone, so that you may live and possess the land the Lord your God is giving you. And Leviticus 19:15, do not pervert justice. Do not show
Mhm.
partiality to the poor or favoritism to the great, but judge your neighbor fairly. And then I would throw in all of the imprecatory psalms. I've got a friend that called them the predatory psalms, and I like that terminology too. And the a few of the leaders of this riot that has broken into the church, they have been arrested, and the church must receive justice. As Christian people, we understand that whether it's with our children or with others, that what happens if there is no justice, there is no discipline, there is no punishment, what happens to the sinful nature? It gets out of control. It becomes
Mhm.
worse, more violent, more caustic with their language, more brutal with the tactics.
I would like to say, I know there, as I'm looking through my social media feed, I'm seeing some friends from churches, maybe in Texas or other places that are stereotypically armed. Okay. Um, and I'm not against being armed, certainly. Um, but I don't think it need be a capital offense what happened, right? Like people walk into your church and you should respond with blazing firearms. No, not at all. Um, I don't think it would be justifiable to use lethal force simply for a protest. I think the church handled it pretty well, actually. The pastor was able to stay collected enough in that calamity, in that chaos, to actually witness Christ in the mayhem of that. Okay. Um, and I also suspect there were other people in that church, maybe who were armed and were waiting for a circumstance wherein, okay, I am praying that I am not called upon to do this right now. But if I see somebody pull a weapon out and begin harming or killing people, I have to respond immediately. And one of the Marxist tropes is that your goal is your enemy's response. We're going to provoke you, we're going to inflame you, and the goal is um, to get a response out of you that makes you into the aggressor and us the victim. And this goes back to like the playground bully putting his finger like right here and say, "I'm not touching you. I'm not touching you. I'm not right." And then kid B drills kid A in the face. And even though he started it, he's now the victim, right? That's the situation that's happening here. All right. But I do think to the people who said like, try that in our church and you're gonna, catch smoke. It's like, I don't think it's biblical. Disagree if you'd like,
Well,
but what do you think?
that is the next point. And Andy, uh, how does a church, maybe your church, respond when invaded during worship?
Well, I don't want to speak for my church specifically, just in case we're ever targeted. I don't want people to know what we do,
There you
but
go.
we do a few
Wise.
things, and I think there are some general tenets that every church could consider. And by the way, Christians within every church too. Christians should consider that prayer is the most effective protest. So even if you do fall on a different side of this issue for well-intentioned reasons, it might confuse me why you do, but if you do, one of the most effective protests you can proffer is to pray to God for change. Okay, secondly, if people storm your church, I don't think it's out of the realm of reality to say you could fold your hands right then and say you could begin praying immediately. Then I would say it's important to call 911 if you can. I would highly, highly recommend not engaging. In fact, if you can at all help it, I would recommend speaking very, very, very little, because you don't want to be put on blast on TikTok or the internet, especially in the manipulated forms that you'll see it from illicit media actors. I guess I wouldn't be against trying to flee, but I think there's so many caveats to that. I don't know that I would put it high on the list, even though I'm not against it. It's just that you don't know if they're coming in with weapons. You don't know if they're staging people at exits. And then one thing that we did get advice about, which I think every church can consider, is having a go bag or a grab bag, whatever you want to call it. So that, let's say that there is a dramatic campus event on whatever scale of severity. In that bag, you could have flashlights, you could have a printed campus map or two, you could have key phone numbers for contacts, you could have possibly spare keys, something that could be turned over to the authorities if they make contact with you, so that the authorities have access to what they need to have access to on your property.
Yeah,
Do you
a
guys
couple of
lock
things.
your doors during church services?
Well, yeah, that's what I was going to get to is, you know, some of the responses that I've seen as I've asked this question is, well, maybe you just keep preaching, ignore them. Well, I know what it's like to have like one autistic young man who danced around our Christmas tree. Okay, we just kept on going, and because he's there innocently, not able to control his actions and so forth. It's a totally different, but it was still disruptive. It was hard to focus on the worship, me preaching, and everyone else focusing just, hey, he's doing his thing. He's dancing to the Lord around the Christmas tree, but as one guy who wants to be there, as opposed to even as one individual who doesn't want to be there. Now multiply it by numerous people. And you have to understand, with a situation like happened last Sunday in that Southern Baptist church, those people were not there to hear God's word. So you just preaching louder or playing the organ louder or everyone joining and singing is not going to work. I think of Jesus in the synagogue when he said from Isaiah's prophecy, well, this is fulfilled in me. And what did they do? Well, this is a mob, and they took him out and they tried to throw him off a cliff and kill him. Okay, that was the Son of God. I don't think we, as the sons and daughters of God, are going to fare any better. So maybe we can talk about how do we get people out, but this gets to what Josh just said: is maybe we need to be discussing how not to let people in. Uh, and so for our church, for example, we've got a back door, and some people park in that way so they can come into for Sunday school and the fellowship hall. Most of the people come in the entryway though. But I was thinking, yeah, maybe what we need to do is let people know we're going to lock that back door. And then for us, I know some churches have said they've been locking their front door, and then only they let members in, or they have an usher or an elder that's there. I don't think we personally at our church would need to lock the door, because it's like 50 yards between the parking lot and the entryway, which is the glass doors and glass windows, and you're going to be able to see who's coming. And then I think there is some wisdom then to locking the doors as long as you let your members know. And then regular visitors let them know, hey, it's all about protection. We want to be safe here because this is a private space. It is God's sacred space. Go ahead, Josh. Oh, you muted yourself.
Sorry about that.
There you
Okay. I do think it forces a different context to be established. If you have protesters who walk in through open doors, that's one thing. If you have protesters who incapacitate one of your ushers and then break through plate glass doors, that's a very different situation, as far as how you might respond. The pretext of any innocence, or the pretext of we're here, but this is nonviolent. Well, now it's violent, and so
go.
um, it does force the context to stay peaceful. Um, if you are just airtight in your security while the service is happening, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I wrote this that I don't think I could have remained as calm as that pastor did with all of those rioters yelling, with Don Lemon getting right in his face, and he's still preaching Jesus. Uh, and and I know in our church, there's probably those who are uh, going to be there protecting people. We're going to be. I had just texted a couple of our men this week about ordering some books in order to learn about security for our church and then having a security team and so forth. And then one of those same members texted me today and sent me an article of older men and older women, younger men and younger women in Christian churches that are taking firearm safety courses and where it's available, taking those classes and then coming into churches because this is just one example of rioters coming in, but we've seen it in other churches where you have a lone gunman coming in and going after the innocents that are just there to worship and sing. Uh, and so I think it is vital for us to be prepared and to know that these are things that are going to happen. When I asked a question on Facebook of, hey, we're going to be talking about this. What have you done? And I had a classmate of mine who is out west and in a big city, lots of drugs, lots of people that are not in the right minds. And he had a long post. I'm not going to read it to you guys. You can find it if you're interested on my wall, where he talked about having 20 years in the ministry in that location and about 10 times, that's a lot, 10 times of one or more individuals coming in. And thankfully, he had a safety security team that was there and they were prepared on how to deal with it. And he's the one that said, just keeping on preaching and playing the organ, that's not going to work when you have these mentally ill people. Uh, and so the big thing is to be prepared. This is the same individual that he had shown me a video where he was in his church office and he saw a guy outside on their security camera, just so strung out on drugs. He is just dancing all over the place and the pastor's laughing and so forth until the guy starts going around the church and it's also a school and he's trying the doors and then the pastor realizes one of the doors is unlocked, so he stopped laughing, he stopped watching the video, and he met the guy at the door and then tackled him. He was a high school football player, tackled him and held him down until the police got there. But because it's a liberal city, it was like what you do with squirrels, it was catch and release. And he's off to go do more drugs and do more harm to other people. But I tell the story because we need to be prepared for these kind of things. Andy, you want to add anything?
No, just that resonates with me. In Vegas, we've had a handful of mentally ill vagrants approach the doors during worship, and adding to the list of the things that we talked about. And maybe the obvious implicit thing here is that simply having a presence and eyes and ears near the entrances is very, very crucial.
So I'm going to spring this one on you, Josh. Uh, Someone sent this to me. It was a picture of a church door, and it said, "Warning, please know that this is not a gun-free zone. We are heavily armed. Any attempt will be dealt with deadly force. Yes, we are a church, and we will protect our people." Signed, the pastors. What do you think of a sign like that? There you go.
I mean, it makes way more sense than saying, gun-free school zone.
Yeah.
Because what is that
Why?
communicating? Everyone
Yeah.
here is unarmed. And so I am, in case you didn't know this, I am a firearms instructor. Okay. I have a lot of experience with firearms. Um, you can get a Glock 19 with a 50 round magazine. They're not illegal. Um, you can do an incredible amount of damage with that before the police get there. What's the old expression? When seconds count, the police are only minutes away. Um, and I'm not trying to slam the police. It's just reality, you know?
They're
Um,
reactionary. And what we're talking about is, instead of reacting, being proactive and protecting ourselves.
I think that you have a biblical um, ethos that would support using lethal force to defend people that you love when someone else is attempting to kill them. I mean, that's really what it comes down to. If you don't believe that, well, then we're going to disagree. Um, but if you have a person bring a firearm into a building with uh, with women and children who are trying to worship and not harm anybody, and you intend to kill them, um, lethal force is absolutely reasonable at that point because that person has chosen death to occur. Um, your choice at that point is how many of my people are going to be taken out before before lethal force is used. And if you wait for the police to come, they're going to use lethal force anyway. I mean, we've seen that over and over and over again. But now instead of that happening immediately, you have, I, I mean, pick a number um, of of parishioners of the elderly, of children who were killed needlessly before the threat was stopped. And so I don't think a Christian ever has the right to make the choice for death to be a thing that's going to happen today. Okay. When somebody else makes that choice for you, you do have the right to say, okay, is it going to be me or you? And we may disagree about that, but I
Well,
don't think that's unbiblical.
yeah, and for our listeners, one of the topics that Josh is touching on here about protection, justice, firearms, and so forth. That's one of the topics that is on the docket, but keeps getting pushed aside.
Yeah.
But it is going to be one that we're going to be dealing with in the future. And I do like my son-in-law to be. He was texting me uh, different images and so forth of firearms because he knows way more about guns than I do. He was talking to me about building firearms. I said, I don't even know anything about guns, let alone how to build a gun. But I do like my son-in-law if he's willing to talk to his future father-in-law about this, and he's willing to protect my daughter, his future wife. So lastly, we touched on this in the beginning with what Josh was talking about with ICE officers. So Andy, what kind of discussions on ICE, immigration, protesting, et cetera, should our churches be having? And the reason I ask is I had seen one pastor that was asking other pastors this question, and he had asked a couple of things. He said, should we talk about questions like this? He's in a big city, and uh, big cities are always going to be more liberal. It's just the way it is. And so he's ministering to people, and he asked, uh, "How will we as pastors respond when a member brings a petition supporting ICE or demanding ICE leave our city? A member is recruiting others for sidewalk protests for or against ICE. You're asked about the difference between legally and illegally expressing one's opinions in protest, letter writing, and so forth. And then Some of his questions, those ones I read, are more even. Others, they had a more, they were questioning more about ICE. So he's ministering to people that are more liberal, more leftist. And I said, those are really good questions, but perhaps you could also ask some questions with your pastors, like, how do you minister to a member who's in law enforcement or an ICE officer and he feels like the community or some members of this church are against him? How do you minister to a member who's law enforcement officer or ICE officer who's been injured on the job by protesters? How do you counsel a family who's been victimized by an illegal immigrant, but is told by the media that the public should be supporting illegal immigrants? And just trying to let him know, hey, I appreciate those questions, but also make sure you frame your questions from the other side. So, with that being said, Andy, what do you have to add about how we as pastors and churches and Christians can talk about these topics?
A few points. First of
Yeah.
all, questions and discussions like the one we're having tonight are important to initiate. Doesn't have to be with the entire congregation, but you could begin with your council, or even better yet, you could begin with your elders or even a key elder around the campfire, so that you can at least explain your hesitancy or your concern or your just the fact that you're wrestling with these things and you're trying to sort it out. Secondly, for those who want to protest in the given time, I guess I would encourage brother pastors in this way and say, or anyone, frankly, telling the truth is always the most loving thing you can do. But in this environment, it's going to be very, very difficult. Whether you realize it or not, the nature of the current protests are intended to be revolutionary. And I'm not so sure that we Christians are looking to be a part of a revolution that is subverting duly elected officials or the decisions that they've made that do not contradict the scriptures. Deploying ICE for the sake of immigration, illegal immigration enforcement, is not contrary to the Word of God. I'm not suggesting you lecture, but I am saying that you have to ask and dig at the motive, and then help people understand or shepherd them to see, maybe this isn't the best way for a Christian to be living out their vocation in these times. The second thing is, that's at the very least, initiating conversations like these. I think that certain congregations, not all, but certain or some congregations might be able to begin to plan so that they're prepared, so they can have discussions around, what will our options be in case something happens. We pray that it never does. At the most, there are a lot of materials out there now by Mike. You've got a book that you wrote, Mike. I'm sure you're happy to share a link.
Mike wrote a book.
Josh, multiple presentations and also multiple documents. And then I've got a paper that I'm willing to share as well. And there are other pastors who've written Bible studies on these things. It may just be time to familiarize yourself with what's going on right now, because it is out there. It is explicable. And there are good Christian confessional Lutheran pastors who have, and teachers, ministers who have done the hard tilling here, and you can harvest from their work. So, for example, talking about history, if anybody even knows anything about it anymore, you can talk about the history of the last 200 years, what it's led to, how it's cyclical, not to be politically focused, but to see how, what it might, what cause for discernment it might give us as Christians. And then I guess the last thing is, because I can be the dour one, I suppose, here. We don't know what will come. We have full and ultimate confidence in Christ. That said, Christians can, at the same time, with joyful confidence in Christ, stop pretending like what's going on right now is no big deal. It is something to be discussed, to be planned in advance for, prepared in advance for, and something to shepherd our people through, because if we're talking about it, you better believe our people are wondering about it too.
Yeah, I appreciate that. That reminded me of uh, a friend of mine told me recently about they know someone in a restaurant in downtown Casper. I was told as soon as I moved here, it was more liberal because Casper, like all of Wyoming, is very conservative. So here is a liberal restaurant in town. They've had drag queen shows and so forth in their restaurant. And so I guess the staff, with everything going on with ICE, had said, well, what are we going to do if ICE comes to Casper? Are we going to serve them? And a bunch of the staff said, no, I won't serve them and so forth. Well, someone who is logical on staff said, what are you talking about? Of course, we're going to serve them. What are we going to do to our restaurant if we, in a conservative city like Casper, turn off probably 70, 80% of our clientele if we say we're not going to serve them? And then she also said, besides, we're in Casper, Wyoming. ICE is not coming here. It's just the nature of it. But they're a business and they're talking about this. You're right. We as Christians should be talking about this. I'll be talking about not ICE in my sermon, but in my sermon tomorrow, if anyone wants to listen to it next week on the Raised with Jesus Network, is I'll be talking to our members to say, hey, we should be talking as pastors and people about political issues because the devil has made all theological issues seemingly political. And if we're not talking about them, well, you can bet people want to know the answers. And so they're going to go to the men are going to listen to non Christian men, and the women, we talked about this before, they're going to be filled with toxic empathy. And so we as pastors and members should be talking about these things, always applying the light of God's word to the darkness in our culture.
One more thing to add to that, Mike. Amen to that. Among other things, too, I think it's important that pastors begin to talk about who to trust. And I'm not suggesting that they spend Bible class hour or council meetings or pulpit time saying, don't go on TikTok. But Christians in our current culture need to understand that their ability to discern the times are not going to be aided by digesting 10-second or 30-second or 1 minute video shorts, which cannot possibly represent the broader context. However, our 70-year-old members need to hear the same thing because the video segments are not much longer on the ABC Evening News. So I think people need to remember that their ultimate source that is trustworthy is the scripture. And I do sense that people grasp the scriptures poorly when it comes to filtering their politics through the scriptures and not vice versa. So this calls for us to go back to the word. And it's the one source that you've got that's not heavily skewed.
Josh, how do you want to answer this question of what kinds of discussions on ICE, immigration, protesting, and so forth should our churches, or even for you in high school, what kind of discussions should we be having?
I think we should get into the habit of engaging these things um, intentionally and systematically. And there's going to need to be some sort of a preamble for this conversation. And I would use the following maritime analogy, if you would indulge me. Um, I spent quite a bit of time in Grenada, actually. I've been there 4 times. And one of the trips we were there doing mission work involved scraping barnacles off the bottom of a sailboat. Um, but
Creature report.
oh,
Creature
stop
report.
it. Oh, you have small children. Yes. Thank you for that. That's in my head now. Um, as we have allowed people to drift rudderless because we have just totally disengaged from everything political in the church. Um, we have people in my church who support Planned Parenthood, who support abortion, who support the LGBTQ movement. We have women who are feminists. And just to recap the episode in 20 seconds, can you be a Christian and be a feminist? Feminism thinks and proposes that Christianity is an oppressor structure to be abolished. How can you be both at the same time when one says the other should be destroyed? They've probably never heard that, though. They've never heard the counterpoint. And so um, we've been drifting rudderless for the last 30 or 40 years, where we've had excellent doctrines in one area and a total vacuum of applications to culture, sorry, applications of God's word to culture in other areas. And so we have these heretical barnacles that have attached themselves to people's hulls, if you will. And people look down at these things and think that they're part of the ship. They believe, oh, that's me. That's part of who I am. Don't you dare pick at that. And it's really going to be painful to remove all of them. Um, but that doesn't make it not important or a thing worth doing. It's just important to recognize like this is going to be really hard. Um, and the point of the conversation isn't to offend you, but in case it does, yes, when you have things extricated from your life that shouldn't be there in general, that hurts. But it's a conversation that needs to happen, I would say.
That's a good analogy. I like that one. I might use that for my children's devotion tomorrow. Uh, so, wrapping it up here, and I'll say this in my sermon for Sunday as well, is uh, I was told, and I've been told for 30 years, and this happened with my book too, oh, we're not supposed to say anything political. I've had lots of pastors say, I just preach Jesus. Well, that's very pious sounding, but Jesus didn't just preach justification. He preached sanctification. The apostles, they all fill up their epistles with justification and sanctification. Politics in the Greek is nothing more than the issues of the city or the issues of the citizen. And so, what I'll say in the sermon, I say that too, but I also say we have allowed things to become political, these theological issues. The more we talk about politics, not so much from the pulpit, like Andy said, we can talk about these things in Bible study, but especially now I'm blessed to have a small congregation. I can get to all of my members. I know where they stand on different issues and they can talk to me. It's harder in a larger congregation, but we need to be talking about these things. And the more we talk about them, the less political they become. Uh, so, talking about something political, though, our plan is that next week we'll talk about Martin Luther King Jr. And uh, there's a tie with this episode because one of the questions I'll ask these guys next week is uh, the events that happened in that church with the protesters. Is there a connection to the philosophies of Martin Luther King Jr.? So we'll wrap it up here with a quote from Alexander Solzhenitsyn. There is nothing like the wrath of a man who never wanted to be violent, because we are called to be peaceful as Christians. But God also prepares us to be violent when justice for and protection of the innocent is called for. Solomon wisely wrote in Ecclesiastes 3:8, a time to love and a time to hate, a time for war and a time for peace. Until next time, Lord's blessings.